O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are going back to the American Civil War and its aftermath, and we are discussing the influence of Christian leaders and of the gospel on the soldiers, on society, and then how the war ended up and what took place specifically in the South and in the federal government in the Reconstruction era, and how that connected with the body of Christ, specifically in the South. And we're going to see that though the nation was divided, the Lord used the division of the body of Christ between northern and southern churches and Christians to spread the gospel, and he actually brought about major revivals during the war that led to the salvation of thousands of soldiers that had an impact after the war on the nation and set a trajectory for many of the aspects of the nation for decades to come. So to start off, I want to start with the Christian leaders that were during that played major parts during the Civil War. First of all, I think probably would you say Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis would be most well known.
I might shade towards Robert E. Lee, but both of them are pretty high up there for Confederate leaders, about the two most.
Right. Okay. Let's start with Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, I'm not sure what his specific denomination was, but he was a devout believer.
Yep.
I'm not sure. So maybe you know more about him than I do. I would imagine that because I'm pretty sure he was kind of wealthy. Yeah, he was wealthy. He had a mansion, so he must have had owned slaves. Right?
Yeah.
But he was a believer, and in his management and his presidency of the Confederate States of America, he would often order, presidential orders for fasting and prayer to the nation.
Yeah.
For example, in 1863, after the defeat at Gettysburg, he ordered that all the citizens of the Confederacy would humble themselves with fasting and prayer and confess their sins to the Lord, because the Lord was chastising them for whatever sins he thought that they were committing. Also, that's Robert E. Lee. Jefferson Davis, after the war, remained a devout Christian. I don't know if do you know anything about after the war, how he led his life? I imagine he was involved in some official positions.
Yeah, I don't recall.
But anyway, he was a believer. A lot of people think that he was some terrible monster, but he actually, he loved the Lord Jesus, and he sought to follow the commandments of the scriptures, even though he might have had blind spots on issues. Now Robert E. Lee.
Oh, I do want to say in general, one of the interesting things about the Civil War is that both sides viewed it as, we're on God's side. God will give us the victory. Mm-hmm. So I just interesting, and for some people it was a little bit, not challenging to their faith to have both sides fighting, both thinking that God's on our side, and so He must give us the victory. Also, the South is their motto was Deo Vindici, the Lord will avenge.
Oh,
I
didn't know that.
That was their national motto. Basically, they thought with the Lord being on their side, and that they had been wronged, and that the Lord would fight for them.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's the national sentiment of the
Right.
South.
Right, and basically of the North. Besides not being vengeance,
Yeah, no, I do.
but putting down rebels.
Yeah, and I do think the South was in general more pious, but the North felt more that they were on the right side of the issue. Therefore, the Lord will support them.
Yeah. So the South being pious. Let's talk. Yeah, you're right. We should have gone to the general aspects of it first. The South being pious was because the South was less influenced by rationalism, and by the Enlightenment ideas, and also by non-Christian cults like the heresy of Unitarianism, and all these cults that came out of the early to mid 1800s, such as the Mormons and the Jehovah's the Jehovah's Witnesses didn't come up yet.
Won't be long though.
Right. There were also so these Enlightenment rationalist ideas. Also, Darwinism was big in the North because there was more of a European influence in the North. The South was more confined. They didn't have, and also they didn't have as much of a downgrade in their theological institutions, such as Union Theological Seminary in the North, and also Harvard University were basically heretical by the mid 1800s.
Yeah.
So in the South, you have less influence from those non-Christian, anti-Christian, pseudo-Christian ideas and organizations.
And historically, I mean, obviously the South was very rural, and historically, newer ideas moved to the cities first.
Right, exactly. And you had bigger cities in the North, and also you had more immigration in the North because of those bigger
and
cities.
more urbanization.
Right.
Where it's just a tight cluster of people.
Right. Yeah. So, however, the North did have some devout believers. There were a couple of Union generals that were devout believers, but for the most part, most of the Southern leadership were devout Christians. So besides Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, you have Thomas Jackson. Let's see here. You have this man named General Gordon, who was a commander in the Army of Northern Virginia. You have many. So the Army of Northern Virginia we're going to focus on more in this discussion because that's the better known one. I guess before going to the Army of Northern Virginia, we can discuss a couple. Well, at least know a couple of the Union leaders that were devout believers. Now, if you compare the Confederate leaders to the Union leaders, it's a clear imbalance, because most of the Union leaders are not devout believers. Even Abraham Lincoln, who a lot of evangelical Christians today like to think of as a Bible-believing Christian, although he was a big Bible student, he read it a ton, he didn't actually believe the core tenets of the gospel.
I actually read that he was, at that point, he was the only president to not be baptized.
Wow.
Which I don't know how long that went for. I don't know if we've had more that haven't been baptized since then, but
I would imagine, or maybe, I don't know.
It's tough. We definitely have had more that have not been Christians, but that doesn't mean they weren't baptized.
And also, going back to the abolitionist movement, that was obviously a huge factor during the war. Most of the abolitionists were not Bible-believing Christians. A lot of them were either Unitarians or deists or just humanists. Pushing. They obviously use Scripture to justify their arguments and their actions, because most of the population at least gave a ostensible, a favorable ear to Scripture, but they were not, for the most part, devout believers.
Which I do want to say too, that a lot of times you find, and this isn't to say that arguing for abolition was wrong necessarily, but that you find non-believers will throw themselves into certain causes more so because they're looking for a purpose. I mean, just in general, it's something to take out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're trying to justify their sinful lives.
I mean, look at politics.
Make up for it, right? So going back to the northern leaders, so most of them were unbelievers. However, there were a couple exceptions that I know of. First of all, you have George McClellan, who was a Union general. In 1862, he led the major Eastern Northern Army against Robert E. Lee, most notably in the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg. So he was, I don't know what his Christian denomination was, but we know that he was a believer from the beginning of the war. He was defeated at Sharpsburg. Abraham Lincoln took him out of his officer position, and then he went home, and he was told that if he was needed that he would be called back, and he was never called back. So in which year was the presidential race?
1864.
Yeah, 1864. He ran against Lincoln. I forgot on what ticket, and then he lost. Obviously,
I would have been the Democrat.
He lost that Democratic.
Yeah, just the Democrats. Most of the Democrats were in the South, so, and they were no longer part of the Union, so that's why Lincoln won pretty easily.
Yeah. I want to talk about a little bit of what happened after the war. He served as governor of New Jersey. Yeah. And then the second major Union leader who was a believer was Oliver Howard. He was a general during the war. He actually went to seminary, and he served as a pastor for some time before the war. During his time in the army in 1857 is when he was saved. And then during the war, he served as a general. He was noted for just basically witnessing to his Christian faith. He encouraged his soldiers to go to worship services on Sundays. He actually spoke during chapel services at times. And then during the end of the war, he was the leader of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a federal government organization that was founded in order to support former slaves. And he founded a university for blacks in 1867. Then after the war, he negotiated a peace with a Native American tribe and chieftain, and he served as a superintendent of West Point. In 1869, he presented Bibles to all incoming West Point cadets, that they still do today, apparently. And he served as the chairman of the board of the American Tract Society. So I don't know, Casey, if you know any other Northern leaders during the war that were noted for their Christian faith, but those are the only ones I know of.
Not really. I didn't really study too much of that, so that doesn't mean that there weren't. I'm sure there were, but
these are the most well known. As for the Confederates, you have Robert E. Lee, who was a Episcopalian. He was brought up in a believing home in Virginia, all throughout his life. In fact, when he was a cadet at West Point, he committed no infractions, so he had no no demerits on his record, which was almost impossible for a cadet in West Point. So he was blameless, in his walk. And then he treated he did have slaves, although he and his family called them servants.
Yeah,
not slaves.
And Robert E. Lee was definitely one of the Southerners who thought slavery was not right and wanted to see it end, but was more thinking along the lines of like, what's the best way to have it end?
Right.
Like for him, it was like it would ruin his house as far as financially if he just freed all his slaves, so he couldn't do it for that reason. But then also the little bit morally better argument of, all these people that we provide for here, if I just freed them, like what would they do?
Right.
But so he was very much sympathetic towards the cause of the black man in slavery, even as a Southern slave owning slave owner. There we go. Thanks. Yeah.
But he was a key figure, obviously, in the Civil War as a whole, but specifically with his army. So he was offered to the command of the Union forces at the beginning of the war by the Secretary of War, I believe.
Was it Winfield Scott?
Yeah, right, Winfield Scott, and he declined it. Because his state voted to secede from the Union.
Yeah, and he couldn't see himself attacking Virginia.
Right, he wanted to defend his homeland, and he actually at the beginning, after after he was offered the command of the Union forces, he said, his greatest desire was that he would not have to use his military experience in order to fight for the South. He did not want to do it. He was reluctant to do it because he had served as a United States officer all his life, most of his adult life.
Yeah, and this is by the time the Civil War starts, he's relatively older.
He's middle-aged,
and so he's had his career as far as he's concerned, so a lot of the younger guys like make their name in the Civil War. He's more looking at it like, I'm old. I want to go home.
Right, but he certainly made his name.
Oh, I mean, he did make his name more. Which, speaking of which, I did want to mention that, like I said, between probably Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis are the two most well-known Southerners, that he was like immortalized in Southern lore, and people the South viewed him as like above reproach, to the point where in certain battles where he did make tactical errors, they would refuse to blame him on any of it, and instead would find blame somebody else. Like I think of Longstreet for Gettysburg, even though it was a clear Lee blunder. But anyway,
I would actually disagree. I would say it's not entirely Lee's fault. I would say Longstreet actually did make administrative and or tactical errors, but that's another topic. So when General Lee in 1862, the spring of 1862, he was given command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He issued a general order to the army that's at 1864. He issued a general order to the army in which he said, habitually all duties except those of inspection will be suspended during Sunday to afford the troops rest and to enable them to attend religious services. So he wanted his troops to have church services basically every Sunday. He encouraged chaplains to preach the gospel. He encouraged Christian societies to distribute tracts and religious literature and Bibles to the soldiers.
Oh, I did want to say on the chaplains too. Civil War was the beginning of the Army chaplain. Up till then, there weren't Army chaplains, but then I think it was the South that first commissioned Army chaplains. Like that you weren't paid much, but you were paid something. And then actually they were, as you get into the war, they realized quickly that the amount of need for the chaplains was way more than they remotely had. So you have some of the Southern church denominations go around and get like missionary. I don't know if they're technically missionaries, but get a bunch of young men trained to go into the war as chaplains.
Interesting. Yeah. There were many chaplains. So the goal of Robert E. Lee was to have every single unit have its own chaplain, at least every regiment. And also this applies to so Robert E. Lee, he was an Episcopalian. He did all this as a leader of the Army of Northern Virginia, and then when the war ended, he did not have any vindictive feelings towards the North. He wanted to do everything he possibly could to have peace with the Northerners. And he served from I don't know when he started serving, but he served after the war. He devoted his life to leading young men at the college in Virginia called Washington College, where he made sure that they actually had chapel services every day, and he wanted those students to become Christians. He actually wrote or said to someone in a famous quotation, "I desire that every one of those young men become Christians." And then he died in 1870 of heart complications.
Yeah, he had congestive heart failure for a few years at that point.
Right, but he was and in 1864, one of the most explicit things he said about his Christian faith was, "I'm only a poor sinner trusting Christ alone for salvation." And there was a revival in 1864 during that time. Thomas Jackson was the other one who was most well known in the Southern armies. He was a devout Presbyterian. He was saved not too long before the war. I think the 1840s or early 1850s. So he didn't actually grow. Wasn't actually saved at a very young age. It was after he became an adult, after hearing preaching at a Presbyterian church for a while, that he actually devoted his life to the Lord. He was a huge prayer warrior that he actually learned to do in his home church. He was actually asked by his pastor to lead their prayer meeting, and it turns out that he was horrible at leading public prayer. But he determined to. So his pastor then, after the first time, said, "You don't have to do it anymore." But he said, "No, because you want me to do it, I'm going to do it." So he continued to lead the prayers until he was the best.
That's such a Stonewall Jackson thing.
He was the best leader of public prayer in his church.
So Jackson, a couple interesting things on him. He also went to West Point,
right?
And he was, in general, was not the sharpest tool in the shed. But what he did have going for him was that, kind of like that, would work at something harder than anybody and longer than anybody until he was really, really good at it. So at West Point, I think he started out in his class the first year he was like fifth to last, like ranked of all the cadets in his class, and then like each year he moves up, and I think he graduated something like 12th.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole bunch of the teachers that are like, if there was another year, he would have been first.
Yeah.
And also, I did want to mention, before the Civil War, he actually had correct me if I'm wrong on the exact details of this. Was it a Bible study?
Sunday school
for
and a Bible study.
Yeah,
in addition
for some of the black slaves,
for his slaves,
I think others were joining though too, and so some of the white owners were not happy with him, but he basically just told them down and was like, "How dare you?"
And he taught his own slaves how to read so that they could read the Bible.
How many slaves did he have? I didn't think he was that wealthy.
I don't know. At least several.
Okay.
Not enough to have a Sunday school.
Okay, I'll have to look. Yeah, I'll double check that at some point, but because I didn't think he was very wealthy.
And during the war, he that was one of his greatest delights, was to teach them the Bible. And so during the war, they would tell him that they missed him, the slaves there. And also slaves like you said, in the surrounding area came to his Bible study to be taught the Word of God. And so he was a huge factor in making sure that his troops had good chaplains.
He was also a huge proponent, was constantly asking General Lee to not fight on Sundays at all. Thought there should be no fighting on Sundays.
Right. He considered it the Sabbath. He
wasn't alone in that. There were others that were calling for that.
Right, of course. Like Robert E. Lee would rather not as well. He would rather have it devoted to church services. But Jackson is noted for praying, being deeply devoted to prayer, especially before battles. And also he developed a form of, when he prayed, he would like put his whole body into it. He would go off by himself, like into the woods or something. And when he prayed, people would see him like moving his arms and like basically expressing his desperation and his earnestness in his bodily movement. So it looks like he was having a fit or something when he was. Yeah,
that's a very Jackson thing too.
when he was praying, right? But when he died, he said his last words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." And he was beloved by his men, and he was he had a huge Christian testimony. He did not have any. Obviously, he did not have any. As far as I know, he didn't have any vindictive feelings towards the North, but he thought that his cause was just. Besides Jackson, you have the artillery commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, who was a devout believer, as well as Gordon. He was a prominent commander in that army as well. I'm trying to think. Those are the. I'm sorry. D.H. Hill as well. He was a devout believer. And during the war, some of the commanders actually professed faith during the war. Like General
Johnston.
Was it Johnston?
Joe Johnston was one of them.
Okay, and then Hood, I forgot his first initials. Hood confessed faith. He was actually baptized with sprinkling by some chaplain. And then Ewell, General Ewell actually was under Jackson's command, and he actually when he saw Jackson praying one time, he remarked afterward that, "I wish that I had that kind of religion." And eventually he was saved, probably through Jackson's witness to him. But there were many revivals in that army. Let's look at time here. Actually, I wanted to just note, before we take a break and then go to the revivals themselves, we should not forget, in the North there was a huge Christian influence as well. For example, the Young Men's Christian Association was formed shortly before the war through the leadership of D.L. Moody, actually. So D.L. Moody started his ministry. He was a famous evangelist, revivalist. He started his ministry in, at least, if not before, during the 1850s in Chicago. He was actually a shoe salesman, and then he started a school preaching the gospel at a place in Chicago. Eventually became an itinerant evangelist, and he founded, eventually, I believe it was after the war, he founded Moody Bible Institute, which was what it was called. And during the war, he preached the gospel to the Union soldiers. A famous account says that he preached the gospel during the Battle of Shiloh. Actually, during the battle, or at least, actually, it was a 2-day battle, so it was probably after the first day of the battle, or something like that. So he traveled around preaching the gospel. And then, so the Young Men's Christian Association. There were also a couple of other organizations that served the Northern soldiers, distributing gospel tracts and Bibles to them. Unfortunately, the Southern armies had a lack of Bibles, so they had a lot of times they even used Northern Christian organizations to get Bibles to their troops. But there were major revivals in 1863 and in 1864, mainly during the Civil War, that broke out. One of them in both of the armies. Another one of them, I believe, was focused mainly on the Southern Army. But after this break, we will talk about those, and then we will end on Reconstruction. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. And we're back talking about the revivals in the Civil War. The first major one being in 1863. But I want to read some statistics from J. William Jones, who was a chaplain in the Army of Northern Virginia. He wrote a book after the war called Christ in the Camp, where he compiled a bunch of first-hand testimonies of Christianity and the influence of religion in the Army of Northern Virginia. And specifically talking about that army. So when I talked about the Army of Northern Virginia, just to kind of clarify, there were two main armies, Southern armies, during the war. There was the Army of the Tennessee in the west and the Army of Northern Virginia in the east. And then what's notable about the Army of the Tennessee is, I hope that we'll get to talking about him later on, is Nathan Bedford Forrest was the main cavalry commander in that army, the Army of Tennessee. He was basically a cavalry prodigy. Although he had no military experience, he was excellent at using his forces to deceive the Northerners and to capture them, and to win decisive victories through his cavalry horsemanship and through his just understanding of how to basically deceive the enemy. And then I forgot to note, Jeb Stuart was another devout believer in the Army of Northern Virginia. A lot of people don't know that about him, but he was. I forgot which denomination he was. Most of the devout leaders in the Confederate armies were either Presbyterians or Methodists or Episcopalians.
That makes sense.
Not a lot of them were not a lot of them were Baptists. But going back to the number of salvations in the Army of Northern Virginia, or professions of faith, during the end of 1862 and the spring of 1863, there were at least 1,500 professions of faith in the Army of Northern Virginia. From the fall of 1863 to the beginning of 1864, there were at least 5,000 who professed faith in that army. From the beginning of 1864 to the summer of that year, there were at least 2,000 professions of faith. And from May 1864, the spring of 1864, well, actually, from the spring of 1864 to basically for the next year, there were around 4,000 professions of faith. And then this man says, add to these figures at least 2,500 who during the war found Jesus in the hospitals, at home, or in northern prisons. For Christ was in the prisons, and there were some precious revivals at Point Lookout, Fort Delaware, Elmira, which was a huge prison during the war, Johnson's Island, and other points. And we have a grand total of at least 15,000 soldiers of Lee's army who professed faith in Jesus during the 4 years of the war. So the main revivals I was talking about was after the defeat at Gettysburg. There was a revival. And that revival actually was spreading to the northern armies as well. It's estimated during the war that looking specifically to the northern armies, that over 100,000 northern troops professed faith during the war. 100 to 200,000, and then you have about 100,000 total. They think historians believe in the southern armies during the war as well.
Another aspect that about the denominations. There we go. Mm-hmm. Just that most of the main ones split during the Civil War between North and South. So
I'd say before the Civil War.
Yeah, I guess before, but
split.
Very much having to do with that though.
Over slavery.
But so the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately. Right. But they sent chaplains to the armies, preaching the gospel. These revivals. It's I think it's kind of insightful to point out that these revivals happened during times when the suffering was the greatest. So people are seeking, peace with God. They're seeing that this life is going to end soon, and I could die at any moment. Yeah. So
which
I
actually
need to get
a couple
right
of
with
things
God.
on that is like you said. When there's that much death around you, I think that does make you think about what happens when you die. Right. Then in general, the view that God's kingdom was coming soon. That this was a very popular view. A number of people in the North thought that part of the reason for this war is to cleanse. Maybe the South thought this too. Basically, to cleanse the country to prepare for the kingdom to come back. So just this prevailing thought that the Lord's coming back, and you think of like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was the Norse song that was written in this time, 1862, I think. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming
of the Lord.
Yeah, let's keep saying
He trampled down the vintage where the grapes of wrath were sowed. I don't know the rest.
He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword.
His truth is marching on.
Yeah, there we go. But so just this idea that the Lord's coming back and very soon. Yeah,
imminence, which is the view that most people, most evangelicals hold today. I'd say. Yeah. But if you have something tumultuous, calamitous like a war, national war happening, that kind of alarms people. Yeah. So the piety of specifically the Southern soldiers, so they read their Bibles. It's in the Army of Northern Virginia. Every soldier, for the most part, had a Bible, or a New Testament that they would read, and a lot of them gave testimonies to their fellow soldiers. When they were saved, they wanted their fellow soldiers to be saved that didn't know the Lord to be saved as well. And they also did acts of kindness. In fact, this chaplain notes that a lot of the soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia, after they had a battle, a lot of them would go back over the field and care for all the wounded soldiers, including the northern soldiers. In fact, there's one notable example. A sergeant, I don't know if you know this story. Casey. A sergeant in the Southern Army during the Battle of Fredericksburg. His last name was Kirkland. Forgot what his first name was though. So the northern troops had been basically assaulting the Confederate position, and they got slaughtered. And the Southern troops were behind a stone wall, and the Union soldiers on the field of battle in front of them. All the rest of the afternoon and the evening were crying out for water. They were screaming, "I need water. I'm dying of thirst." And finally, this Sergeant Kirkland, he was a devout believer. He went to his commanding general and he said, "Sir, I want permission to go out and to give these soldiers water." And pretty much all of them were Union soldiers. And so although he was not supposed to do it, and there was a good chance he could get killed because he was between the opposing lines.
Yeah.
He was given permission by his general, and he went out, and for I don't know how long, at least an hour or so, he went from soldier to soldier in the whole area where those Union soldiers were lying wounded, and he gave them water. He actually, I believe, he survived the war, but that's just one example of an act of kindness that was done out of Christian, out of compassion, that was done by a Christian soldier. Where do we want to go now? That's basically the revivals. So let's go to Reconstruction.
All right.
How did the war end, Casey? What were its results?
Yeah, so I think we touched on it last week a bit, that it finally concluded with Appomattox, when Grant basically got Lee trapped, and Lee realized that there's no point in fighting, so he surrendered, and that was essentially the end of the war. But so then you have this question of, I forget. Yeah, no. So Lincoln was still alive at that point. Mm-hmm. And
he was killed in April of 1865, right?
Yeah. So you have this question, though, of all these states that just seceded, and you fought to keep them, or the North fought to keep them in the Union, but how do we readmit them back to the Union? Because we want them back in the Union, but obviously their current leadership and their current mentality, and that we just fought a war with them, doesn't mean we just give them half the power of the country right now. Mm-hmm. So there's that problem that they're forced with. And you have Abraham Lincoln, who's just led them through this Civil War, and don't worry, he's got a plan, right? Except for then he gets shot.
Yeah.
And so
he did have a plan.
What was that?
He did have a plan.
He did.
He just wasn't able to carry it out.
And that was, it would have been interesting to see what he would have done, because he joked that he was one of the most hated men of his time. Mm-hmm. Because he was more radical than the moderate Republicans, but more moderate than the radical Republicans. So the radical Republicans wanted all the rights for slaves, and basically just let's give the blacks everything, and the Southerners, who cares about them? And they just fought us, and so they wanted that to the extreme. The moderates were more the moderates were the ones that were not even really against slavery. And so when Lincoln does the Emancipation Proclamation, they're like, that seems pretty far to me.
In 1863, right?
That was when he did that, yeah. And so he's right in between these groups. And then you have Andrew Johnson, who Abraham Lincoln named as his vice president. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, a Southern Democrat. He was from Tennessee, was the only senator, I think, in the South to disagree with his state and stay with the Union.
I want to just note something about
go ahead.
Going back to the Emancipation Proclamation. We have to remember that was a presidential decree. Basically, yeah. It was not ratified or approved by the Congress.
Which is why the 13th Amendment was so important. Which is that freed the slaves.
Oh yeah.
That declared them to be free.
And the Emancipation Proclamation also did not. I don't believe it touched the North. Yeah, it was only the Southern, the Confederate states.
Any slaves that were anybody that was a slave within a state that had not seceded was not freed. So there were a couple of the border states, like Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland. If you were a slave there, the Emancipation Proclamation did not affect you. But so then getting the 13th Amendment through to officially free all the slaves and have it not just be a presidential order that the courts could overrule or a future president could change, that was important. So Andrew Johnson was a Southern Democrat that had stayed with the Union, and in order to try to reassure that he would win his re-election, that's why Lincoln picked him, to try to get some Democrat votes. He didn't even know the guy, really. I mean, he knew of him, obviously, but had met him maybe like once or twice. And when he gets shot, suddenly this man is the president who is running the country and is in charge of this Reconstruction process, and he was not the right man for the job. He was very much a Southerner, thought that slavery was fine, and this is evident.
Although he did hate Confederates.
He did, but he was very. And also I should say the Congress at this point had been mostly taken over by radical Republicans. And so if you think of like the spectrum of radical Republicans, then to moderate Republicans, and then Democrats, they're on Andrew Johnson, and the radical Republicans are on opposite spectrums, where the radical Republicans want to really, this is our chance, we just won the war, let's completely reform the South and remake it how we want it. And Andrew Johnson is, the South, besides seceding, really wasn't that bad. I'd say we just kind of let him back in. And so that was his mode. And anytime the radical Republicans would vote to set up something, he would veto it. And so you have some of the more well-known, like there was a Civil Rights Act, there was something else where I think two of the first laws through Congress to be voted in that overrode a veto. So that means they needed like 66% or something like that. So this is the tension you have. And eventually Andrew Johnson is impeached. And I think that was over trying to replace the Secretary of War. But anyway, he's impeached. Basically, the radical Republicans, Andrew Johnson's just in the way and not helping at all. And I would say the radical Republicans really wanted to institute change. Lincoln was telling them that we need to go slower than that, but he wanted change, and Andrew Johnson didn't want change. And all of this ended up in the South. That Reconstruction in general, I would say, was not a pleasant time.
No.
And I do think that having fought the war and won the war, that it was time to enact some changes, and that maybe not quite as fast as the radical Republicans would have wanted, but that Andrew Johnson basically, I mean, he pardoned, like, and not to say that pardoning was necessarily wrong on an individual basis, but he pardoned like almost everybody. And so you have like the next Congress session when Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederacy, walks into Congress and says, I have just as much to say as you guys do. And like all the Northerners are like, are you kidding me? That Andrew Johnson basically just trying to say, yep, the South can go on as it was. I don't think that was the right move at the time.
Besides slavery.
Besides slavery, yeah. But
they can just have an equal say
in
the federal government.
Yeah. So speaking, in what was actually going on in the South here now, I think it was the 14th Amendment. Sorry if I got that wrong. It could have been the 15th. Blacks were given the right. Black men were given the right to vote, and so
15th Amendment.
Okay, 15th.
1869.
Yep. So this is shortly after.
Remember, 4 years after the war.
Yeah. So at this point, February. So at this point, Andrew Johnson would have been in his lame duck status. Ulysses S. Grant was the next president voted in, and he was more. Obviously, he was more Republican than Andrew Johnson. But so you have the southern states are now very Republican for a brief time, particularly at this point when the blacks are allowed to vote, and the blacks are all voting Republican, and you have this this slow taking back of the states by the Democrats. And you also have, as this goes on, and as the Ku Klux Klan is very violent at this point, and specifically trying to get Democratic votes. They were intimidating. They were killing. There were even several times where a Republican was elected, and they would go and kill the Republican congressman. And you have the people in the North are viewing this more as like, all right, like, yeah, as it goes on and on, the people in the North are more becoming of the attitude of, it's probably just best to just let them be. Like, how much money and how many resources, how many men can we just keep sending down? Like, we won the war, they haven't left, and so we're not changing them this way at the end of a bayonet. And
right, we have to remember that they left troops in the South. During Reconstruction, but, although it was slowly decreased. The amount of
was
troops.
Decreased, and it was. Yeah, each location was different. There were some areas with hardly any troops, and the Ku Klux Klan basically ruled, and there were other areas where the troops were very prevalent, and the key being voting is when it was time to vote for who was going to be in there, because basically at the voting station there would be people with guns.
Yeah, and
it just depended if they're for the Klan or if they were for. If they were like the Army. And basically if they were for the Army, the Republicans would win. If they were for the Klan, the Democrats would win. And yeah, so by the time it gets to 1876, most people, the sentiment about Reconstruction is that it's time for it to be over. Now I will say on the African Americans, they had this brief stretch here where there were a few that were elected into Congress. They were voting, but then as this goes on and the Democrats gain power, you do get more black codes, which people eventually kind of changed to like Jim Crow laws that were meant to stop black people from voting. And also you have sharecropping starting, which is basically the white Southerners' way to basically keep their society going the same way it was without technically having slavery. But they found a lot of loopholes where it's like, yeah, you own the land, but you owe me, this much for it. And if for everything I give you, you owe a 50% interest rate. And
it's basically indentured servitude.
Yeah, basically. And then also they had, so the amendment said about no more slavery, that criminals could be enslaved. And so they would basically, anybody they could catch and come up with any type of trumped up charge, they would convict them, and they would then enslave them. And so basically at this time, the white Southerners, in order to keep their economy going, in order to keep their lifestyle going the way that they knew it, they basically came up with a system that replaced slavery with a not slavery but really close to it. And so to wrap up the general gist of it, so 1876 comes and there's another election. Ulysses S. Grant has just been in office for 8 years. The last couple years... What was that?
I forgot about that. I thought he was later.
Yep. No, he was 1868 to 1876. And he is kind of caught in a hard spot between how much aid to send down, how much he can afford to with elections and such, because it was becoming less and less popular to do so. And so by the time he's done, 1876 comes up and everybody knows it's going to be a really close election. And it is very close to the point where I think the Democrat candidate was Tilden. I don't remember his first name. Maybe Samuel. But anyway, he is one electoral vote away from winning the presidency, and there's Rutherford B. Hayes, who is more than that, but there are 3 disputed states where everyone's saying, I won, no, I won. And so they get together, the Republicans and the Democrats, and they make a deal. And the deal is the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, can be president. However, if we give into that, Reconstruction's over. And the Republicans agreed to that deal, pulled all the troops, say, basically, you guys... we'll let be what's in the South. The Democrats, at the time, you take over, do whatever you're going to do. We're not going to interfere. And so that marked the official end of Reconstruction and set up their society to be a very racist, segregated society that had basically replaced slavery with sharecropping for a long time. Well, I'd say probably by about 1950, sharecropping was phased out because of the Industrial Revolution, and like machines had come in that could pick cotton and is cheaper than then. And then after that point, obviously you get the civil rights movement really picking up, and the blacks getting more and more.
In the 50s.
Right, yeah.
Right, not until the 50s, though.
Yeah, not until the 50s. Which that was probably about when sharecropping was on its way out. But yeah, so that was a real general overview of it.
Good. Thank you. But we have to remember that although there was still obviously there's a lot of animosity, hostility, division, racism, we have to remember that now the blacks actually have more power. They do have more opportunities, and they're, especially with their churches, they're forming societies in the South, and also, so there are a lot of black communities, especially the churches, like the African Methodist Episcopal.
Yeah, and at this point, after they're freed, the blacks are able to set up actual churches. Yeah, right. Instead, whereas before it was just kind of these like little meetings in the fields.
They can have buildings.
And so that part was fantastic. Of course, unfortunately, it's very segregated. Right. There's black churches and there's white churches.
Just like today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But
I saw a statistic that I think today, 87% of churches do not have mixed congregations.
It just goes to show how similar we are to.
Though I would say though, if you look at the statistics for like west of the Mississippi, there are not very many African Americans.
Okay.
So that's probably skewed in that, like, if you're in Montana, like that doesn't mean that you're racist or segregating.
Right.
It just means there's not many African Americans there.
Right. I know. But there's a beacon of hope. You mentioned the Ku Klux Klan. A notable figure in the Ku Klux Klan was Nathan Bedford Forrest, and I already mentioned him, right?
You did mention him.
Did I already mention him?
But you said I hope to talk about him more later. So
right.
Now's your chance.
So he was a huge racist, like a lot of the Southerners. Don't know if he owns slaves. So after the war, so his wife actually was a devout Christian, and she prayed for him throughout the war. And he actually, so Nathan Bedford Forrest, although he was wicked, he actually he's very sympathetic towards Christianity. He tried to avoid. He actually did not drink alcohol. He did not smoke tobacco, and he tried to avoid swearing as much as possible. So he was outwardly moral, kind of, especially because of his wife. He loved her to death, and he was extremely devoted to her. After the war, this is from an article by a pastor named Shane Kassler that he wrote about Forrest. He had no money after the war, so the money that he did have, he decided to go to a poker game after the war and try to multiply it with it. He asked his wife to pray for it, and she said she wouldn't. Although after that night, he returned with $1,500. But in Reconstruction, in 1867, Nathan Bedford Forrest became a head wizard, or a main leader of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was fighting against Northern sympathizers and against blacks, basically. But in 1868, he was in Tennessee. A pro-union governor, the pro-union governor, was defeated in that election, and so Forrest resigned from the Klan, and he wanted his group to disband because he said that they were done with their job. They'd fulfilled their job. And he actually was raised by a Christian mother. And he was, like I said, he was sympathetic towards Christianity. So later on, in the 1870s, in 1875, he was listening to a preacher, Presbyterian, and he preached on Matthew 7, where Jesus talks about the foolish man and the wise man. You either build your house on the rock or on the sand, and he was convicted by that. And he went to his pastor and said, "I am a sinner and I need salvation." And so his pastor told him to go read Psalm 51, the repentant psalm where David asked for forgiveness from the Lord. And from that point on, he was a transformed man. In 1875, he was saved. He was actually invited in 1875 to speak to a black civil rights group called the Pole Bearers Association, which was a precursor to the NAACP, the National Association. What does that stand for?
National
American Association?
For
National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
That's right.
That's what it is. He actually gave a speech in which he encouraged the black people there to work hard, to build their lives, to become good citizens. And so after that he kissed a young black girl on the cheek who offered him a bouquet as a thank you. And for the next 1.5 years or so, 1 to 2 years, he fought for godliness, for righteousness, and he was just a shining a testimony to God's grace in the man who was a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, even though before that he'd been a wicked racist. So that's just one example of the gospel having an impact during Reconstruction, especially in the South. Many of the Southern leaders, like I said, were devout Christians. They did not have any hatred, they did not have any fundamental. They did not view blacks as inhuman. A lot of the Southern Christian all the Southern Christian leaders, they didn't view them as a lesser race. Simply that they were in a condition that was almost irreversible, that needed a lot of time to be remedied. After that time in the South, you have so actually from the Jones book, from that chaplain, I want to just give a few more instances of the South immediately after the war, how the revivals impacted the South in Reconstruction. He says, "It is a significant fact that not only the leading pulpits of the South in all of the denominations are filled by Confederate soldiers, but this is true of quite a number of prominent pulpits at the North." So most of the pastors, preachers in the main churches in the South, the white churches obviously, were former Confederate soldiers. Actually, I should know, it was obviously too late, but in 1865, I believe, President, what's his name of the Confederate?
Davis.
Davis actually issued an order guaranteeing the freedom of any slave that would enlist to the Confederate Army. And they were actually, I forgot about this leader as well. There's a famous leader, General Cleburne, in the Confederate Army. He was also a devout believer, and he was anti-slavery. And he actually was one of the influences that led Davis to issuing this order in 1865. That actually, at the end of the war, the Southerners finally said, "We're in a desperate situation. We need our slaves to help us in the fight. And that's not to say, actually, there were a lot of slaves that actually served as, as cooks, as mule team drivers, driving wagons in the Confederate Army.
And a lot of the wealthier people that went to war would take like one of their closest servants with them.
Right. So Cleburne in the Western Theater, he was killed in 1864 at the Battle of Franklin, I think. But he actually pushed. He petitioned the leaders of the Confederacy to let the slaves join the army, so they could have more help and to guarantee their freedom in response. And it finally came to fruition, unfortunately, at the point where it was of no hope. But going back to Jones's book here, most of the pulpits were filled by Confederate soldiers. In 1867, I addressed letters to all the college presidents and many of the leading pastors at the South in order to ascertain how far our returned soldiers were maintaining their Christian profession and what proportion of them were preparing for the gospel ministry. The replies were in the highest degrees satisfactory and gratifying, showing that about 4/5 of the Christian students of our colleges had been in the army, and that a large proportion of them had found Christ in the camp, been saved during the war. That 9/10 of the candidates for the ministry had determined to preach while in the army, and nearly all of the army converts were maintaining their profession, and many of them pillars in the churches. And then he said, he himself, who baptized many people, he said, of the 410 soldiers that he baptized during the army, only 3 of them had gone back to had basically backslid and denounced Christ. So the South is filled with believers, regardless of its racism. You have the flourishing of the Southern Baptist Seminary at this time after the war, which was a pillar of actually Calvinism when it actually started. You have a theologian named Dabney, R.L. Dabney. He was a huge Southern Presbyterian theologian who was hugely impactful in the South. And eventually, they reconcile, the Southerners and the Northerners reconcile their differences, especially the believers. Yeah. And they and I would say one too, in Christ.
And we talked about this when we went over the Second Great Awakening, about how in Europe the Enlightenment ideas had really taken hold and was becoming more and more liberal, I guess, if you want to use that word, and how the Second Great Awakening pushed that back in America. And I would say the Civil War also pushed that back with the fear of death and the mass conversions and the revivals in the armies, and
also the fact that Darwinism obviously in the 1850s is when it started, and this was spreading before the Civil War in America. And Darwinism, obviously, out of that idea, out of just the general idea of evolution, came the idea that we evolved from apes and that we were continuing to advance. But if you have this war where hundreds of thousands of people are being killed on a huge scale, that people are engaging in the brutalist form of killing each other that's possible, that's ever been seen in human history. How can you argue that we are advancing if we are now killing each other in more brutal fashions in a greater scale than we ever have before? Yeah. So that kind of puts to death the idea of Darwinism. Although people come up with rationalizations.
And I would say too, I think with racism, you do see before Darwinism affecting that. Whereas before, earlier on in the 1800s, most of the white people, I think, viewed it as kind of a necessary evil economically, and we've got to care for these black people, which are not as educated, not as far along. But with Darwinism, as you get more into the later 19th century and into the 1900s, of viewing that we are a superior race because we're further ahead. Evolutionary wise as them, and so I do think you see Darwinism coming in and unfortunately changing people's views on racism in a very negative way.
Right, absolutely. Although, like you said, Casey, because there's such revivals during the Civil War, the Bible is being preached, which is anti-evolution. No matter what people say. So there's a pushback against those ideas in the late 1800s in the United States, and there's preaching going on all over the place with these pastors, like I said, that were saved during the war. D.L. Moody is still active during this time in the late 1800s. Also, Charles Spurgeon is active in England during this time, and his sermons are hugely popular after the Civil War in America, being distributed. People would buy them by the thousands. Yeah. And so the gospel is going forth in America, and also America is expanding into the West. You have frontier places where there are preachers going there to preach the gospel, the circuit riders. And then let's see here. I guess like in regards to Western history, just looking forward to the end of the Civil War. Would you say, like, from my understanding of history, it's basically the age of imperialism and the age of industrialization and of monopolies from the 1870s and on into the turn of the century? Would you say?
Yeah, I'd agree.
Basically, the way to characterize it.
That pretty much sums it up pretty well. And when you say Western, it's obviously Europe as well, not just America,
right, Western history,
including America though too. Yeah.
But to go to the way this impacts the church, the body of Christ, this gives this is where the missionary movement has another push from imperialism, because there are new frontiers with peoples that have never heard the gospel before, where you have people going out and preaching the gospel. There's a man named a Presbyterian missionary named John Peyton who went out at this time. Hudson, I forgot who was first, William Carey or Hudson Taylor, but in the late 1800s, one of them went to China. I forgot which one. But and then
Hudson Taylor was in the 1800s.
Right. Right. So basically, you have this time that we might have to study a little bit more in the late 1800s. You also have a bunch of the rise of more cults, unfortunately, in the late 1800s. I think Jehovah's Witnesses is one of them, as well as Christian Science, I believe, in the United States. And you also have the liberalism that's going on in Great Britain, like with the downgrade controversy in the Baptist Union in Great Britain that Spurgeon is a part of. But still, like I noted in a previous episode, the 1800s is still, it's dominated by the gospel in Western society, at least in Great Britain and in the United States.
Yeah, I was going to say,
and in the United States.
I would say you're starting to lose France at this point.
I'd say you lost France in the beginning of the 1800s.
Yeah,
because of the revolution. Unfortunately, the Roman Catholic Church, they kind of gain a bigger influence in the mid 1800s because of the Second Vatican Council, where they try to win control back over European states. During this time, nationalism is rising. European states are gaining their own national status.
Yeah. You see Italy and Germany both become actual national states.
Right. But yeah, there are lots to discuss. Casey, how do you think we should end?
Maybe we should sing Dixie. No, I'm just kidding.
How does that even start? I only know the tune.
Hold on. Oh, way down south in the land of cotton, Dixieland is soon forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. And then we'll skip to the, oh, I wish I was in Dixie, hooray. Rachel tells me I'm not allowed to sing that song, so I like to slip it in wherever I can.
It's pretty catchy.
It is a catchy song.
I remember being enamored with that when I was a Civil War buff.
Yeah.
But so the Civil War shows us, and Reconstruction shows us that in the midst of division, of sin, of hatred, animosity, pride, and also us killing each other, there can still be the light of the gospel, and God uses it to save people. So no matter how dark your life may be, no matter how many trials you're going through, no matter like if people hate you, Jesus said, "Love your enemies," and that's what we see in the Civil War with the soldiers, and after the war, they were former enemies, and they were able to reconcile to one another, and the gospel went forth. So in the midst, when the world looks like it's falling apart, your world even, the Lord is still in control. He's still using the gospel to save people. He's still building up His people, and that's what we need to do today. So let's pray for our brothers and sisters for revival, and preach the gospel as we're given opportunity, and just continue to be faithful to the Lord. Anything else, Casey?
No, I don't think
I have anything else. Thank you for listening to another episode of the King's Hand History. Until next time, please pray for this ministry, and if you're on Facebook, go to the King's Hand in History Podcast Students. Join there for discussion, and you can visit us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. Also, check out my blog, bearingchrist.blog. And until next time, look for the King's Hand in History, in your history, and follow him faithfully. God bless.